Hello, everyone. We're very excited to have you come out today for the first Axton Reading Series event of the semester. I am Christy Maxwell. I'm the Director of Creative Writing here at the University of Louisville, and I'm really excited to have the Director of Undergraduate Studies, Sarah Strictly, come up and say some words about our guest.
Hello. I knew if I waited long enough, you'd respond. Thank you. Welcome. Happy to have you here. I'm Dr. Strictly. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies in English. I'm the faculty editor of Miracle Monocle. Can we get a few woots from the Monocle editors in the house? Yep. I'm thrilled to have you all here tonight to welcome Vivi Ganeshananthenan to UofL's campus for the second time. It's been a while, but you're back. This is not the first time we've met. I'm going to give you a little deep backstory on all of that, but first I want to acknowledge that we have a long history of offering students the opportunity to rendezvous with writers through the Axton Reading Series. It was established in 1999 through the generosity of the late William Axton, a former UofL English professor, and his wife, the late Anne Axton. The series brings highly distinguished writers from across the country to the University of Louisville for 2-day visits to read from their work and to share their knowledge and expertise with the university and the Louisville community. I also want to give you a heads up about a few upcoming events. So Sugi will be running a generative writing session tomorrow morning from 10 to noon. Grab your coffee, head on up to the 3rd floor of Axton. All of you are welcome to join us there. I also want to let you know that the second Axton reading of the semester will feature the writer Hannah Petard, who is the author of 6 books, including the novel If You Love It, Let It Kill You. If you Google it, you can learn a little bit of the history on that one. It's juicy. That reading will be taking place on October 16th at 6 p.m. in the Writing Center here in the library. And there'll be a fiction workshop the following morning from 10 to noon, again in Bingham 300. And I encourage all students to throw their hat in the ring for that opportunity to study with Hannah Petard. Finally, I want to let you know that Miracle Monocle and the Writing Center will be co-hosting our annual Halloween open mic. That'll take place not on Halloween, because you should go out and do things with your friends on Halloween, but the night before, so October 30th, it's a Thursday at 6 p.m. in the Writing Center. All right, now to the good stuff. So, I realize that this revelation will date us, but I first met Sugi more than 20 years ago, when we were both in our first years of study at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And while I don't recall my first Sugi sighting, I do recall becoming aware of a writer who was already working on a novel when she arrived in Iowa City, which was very impressive, maybe a little intimidating. And then, of course, I met her, and she was perfectly down to earth and extremely kind and such a pleasure to run into at the Day House or one of the many other writer lairs in town. As anyone who has met her will attest, Sugi is just the best. Ask her to blurb your book, and she'll blurb the best blurb that ever blurbed its way into the world. Catch her at a conference, and you'll fall right back into the kind of smart and saucy chats you were having decades ago. She is, as they say, an excellent literary citizen. And I mention our Iowa days because, as it happens, the pages she was drafting during that time would turn out to become her first published novel called Love Marriage in 2008. The book was named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post and long listed for the Women's Prize. Her second novel, Brotherless Night, was published in 2024 and became a New York Times Editor's Choice, an NPR Book of the Year, and the winner of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction and the 2024 Carol Shields Prize. In addition to these publishing accolades, Suki has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for the Advanced Study at Harvard, Yaddo, McDowell, and the American Academy in Berlin. Her work has appeared in Granta, the New York Times, the Best American Nonrequired Reading, among many other publications. She currently teaches in the MFA program at the University of Minnesota, where she is a McKnight Presidential Fellow and Associate Professor of English. And she hosts a really cool podcast, if you're into that sort of thing, called Fiction Nonfiction on Literary Hub. Of course, in presenting the sequence of events that began in Iowa City in 2003 and culminated in these oppressive achievements, I have managed to erase all of the hard work involved. Like a magic trick, Sugi simply arrives in the cornfields of Iowa, is awesome, and then emerges as an award-winning writer. It's easy peasy, right? Anybody could do it. Incidentally, the trick of artfully concealing hard work was something I found myself considering on a craft level as I reflected upon the experience of reading Brotherless Night. And as I know from the experience of writing historical fiction, one of the many perils in undertaking this work involves balancing the desire to honor complex truths with the needs of the story as a work of art. And there's often tension between the labor of research and the task of spinning a persuasive yarn. If you do your job well, readers never notice your struggle. If not, the realism is likely to collapse. Despite the fact that I am almost pathologically inclined to dissect novels as I read them, do you do this too? My experience of reading the story of Sashi, the 16-year-old girl who wants to become a doctor, and the 3 decades-long Sri Lankan civil war that tears her family and her country apart was thus. I slipped into the continuous stream of the storytelling and did not awaken until I reached the end of the book, and then I moved out into the world with the story still spinning in my head and pondered the echoes I observed in our current political moment. The realism Sugi conjures on the page is so deeply immersive as to render much of the hard work she has done, the meticulous research, the interviews, the years of writing and rewriting to bring the story world into being. That work is largely invisible. You don't notice it happening because it's so well done. Readers who are unfamiliar with Sri Lankan history will emerge with a deeper understanding of the region and its complexities, perhaps without even noticing that they are learning along the way. And this is all, of course, to Sugi's credit. But there's yet another balancing act I'd like to acknowledge here. Brotherless Night is a book that is unafraid to examine uncomfortable events. A murdered boy face down on the street, a brother engulfed in flames, young people plucked from their bicycles and disappeared, and yet the experience of witnessing decades of the narrator's life is also one of richness, fullness, and beauty, in part because it is so artfully written, but also because Sashi's gaze is so strong, steady, and unwavering. Against all odds, she becomes who she wants to be. Her act of becoming is, therefore, an act of radical resistance. As Danielle Evans, another Writers' Workshop alum, remarks of Brotherless Night, it is unafraid to look directly at the worst of the violence and erasure we have perpetrated or allowed to happen, but is insistent that we can still choose to be better. Please join me in welcoming Sugi to the podium.
Sarah, thank you so much for that extraordinarily generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be back here in the Bingham Poetry Room where I was last in the fall of 2008. I still remember it as absolutely one of the best reading events that I got to do with such a warm and wonderful audience on such a beautiful campus. So it's really just a treat to be back here with your wonderful faculty, and also I understand I get to meet people who work on Miracle Monocle, which is very cool. Which I've been following along in your adventures online, as Sarah and I are connected on social media to kind of see all of the ways that the journal has evolved over the years. So congratulations to those of you who have been doing that work. I feel like it's really important. So I'm going to read for probably just about half an hour, and I often read from the beginning of the book, but in this instance, I'm going to do that very briefly, and then I'm going to switch to a couple of scenes that are set at a university, because it's always fun to read scenes set at a university when you're at a university, and this is among the many things that Brotherless Night is. And thank you, Sarah, for that amazing reading of it. It's a campus novel. I didn't really realize I was writing a campus novel when I was writing it, but it's kind of like a book about school. And it's a book that's heavily influenced by my experiences teaching, my experiences as a student, and the research that I got to do with people who were attending university during the Sri Lankan Civil War under very difficult circumstances. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this context, I'll try and provide as much of it as I can as I'm going along. And I'll also just say that it is a novel that's very much about politics. And as you might have gotten from Sarah's description, it does question the place of violence in our society, the forms in which it appears, its perpetrators and victims. And so it does also portray violence. And so I will just flag that for you. And also, because she's trying to become a doctor, there's a fair amount of medicine. I'll say also that I'm going to try to read from a scene with a lot of complicated medical terminology, and maybe I'll be able to do all of the complicated medical terms. I've never done it, except to myself. So this is from the prologue. And it's a novel in the first person from Sashi's point of view, beginning in New York, 2009. I recently sent a letter to a terrorist I used to know. He lives near me, here in New York City, and when I opened the envelope and slid in the note that said, "I would like to come and see you," I thought of how much he had always required of me, and how little I had ever asked of him. Even when I was growing up in Sri Lanka, before I had ever heard the word terrorist, I knew that if a certain kind of person wanted something done, I should comply without asking too many questions. I met a lot of these sorts of people when I was younger because I used to be what you would call a terrorist myself. We were civilians first. You must understand that word, terrorist, is too simple for the history we have lived, too simple for me, too simple even for this man. How could one word be enough? But I am going to say it anyway, because it is the language you know, and it will help you to understand who we were, what we were called, and who we have truly become. We begin with this word, but I promise that you will come to see that it cannot contain everything that has happened. Someday the story will begin with the word civilian, the word home. And while I am no longer the version of myself who met with terrorists every day, I also want you to understand that when I was that woman, when two terrorists encountered each other in my world, what they said first was simply hello, like any two people you might know or love. Part 1, A Near Invisible Scar. Chapter 1, The Boys with the Jaffna Eyes. Jaffna, 1981. I met the first terrorist I knew when he was deciding to become one. Kay and his family lived down the road from me and mine in one village of the Tamil town called Jaffna in Sri Lanka. The Jaffna Peninsula is the northernmost part of the country. Many people have died there, some killed by the Sri Lankan army and the state, some by the Indian peacekeeping force, and some by the Tamil separatists, whom you know as the terrorists. Many people, of course, have also lived. In early 1981, I was almost 16 years old. I already wanted to become a doctor like my grandfather, and I had recently begun attending my brother's school, where girls my age were accepted for advanced level studies. In those days, I thought mostly about the university entrance exams. Kay, too, dreamed of medical school. And this was what made us alike, long before Kay chose the movement, long before I treated patients in a New York City emergency room, long before we became so different. Kay had the upper hand from the first, not because he was 1 year older or a boy, but because I was his patient. Our meeting was both gruesome and fortunate for me. On the day that we met, I was boiling water for tea. I had to use a piece of cloth to hold the pot's metal handle. But that morning, the cloth slipped, the handle slipped, and the pot slipped, pouring scalding water all over me. I screamed and screamed for my mother, "Amma!" My shrill voice carried out onto the road where Kay was passing. Letting his bicycle fall in the dirt at our gate, he ran inside. By the time he reached me in the kitchen at the back of the house, Amma had already found me. As bubbles rose and popped on my skin, I shut my eyes, but I could hear her sobbing and the sounds of pots and pans clattering to the floor. With every clang, heat flared around and inside me. Under my skin, another skin burned. I cried and called for Muruhan, Pilar, Shiva. Sashi, Kay said, and I opened my eyes to his face without recognizing it. Sit, he said, and pointed to a chair. When I kept screaming but did not move, he grabbed my hands, pushed me down into the chair, and peeled my blouse up, baring my scorched stomach. I heard Amma's ayo beside me, as though she were speaking from a great distance. Snatching a bowl of eggs off the table, Kay began cracking them onto the wounds. I have to fetch water, Amma said. Clutching a pan, she tried to move past him. But he put his shoulders between her and the doorway. This will cool the burn, he said. She stood there uselessly. I stared at him, trying to focus on anything but the pain, and saw only his thumbs working in and out of the eggshells, scraping the slime of the whites cleanly onto the swelling rawness. He did it very swiftly, as though he had had a lot of practice, as though every scrap of egg was precious. My skin was so hot that even now when I remember those quick and clever hands and the slippery shock of relief, I cannot quite believe that the eggs did not just cook on my flesh. When the last one was cracked and steaming on my skin, Kay looked up at Amma. Are there more? She did not respond, still stunned. More eggs, he said. She blinked, then nodded. Good, keep covering the burn, he said. I'll go for the doctor. When Kay returned with the physician half an hour later, the older man looked over the makeshift dressing with approval. It should heal, he said. You may not even have a scar. My own mother used to crack eggs onto burns. This is not the kind of medicine they teach in school. Whose idea was it? Kay glanced at me without saying anything. I crackled inside still. I didn't know what to do, Amma said softly. His idea, I said. So I began as Kay's patient, though he ended as mine. So I'll pause there and give you a little bit of background before I go on. So Sashi has 4 brothers. The oldest is also trying to become a doctor. The next oldest is trying to become an engineer. The next oldest is 1 year older than her. And he's also trying to become an engineer, and Kay is essentially his classmate, yearmate, and basically all of her brother's best friend. She has 1 younger brother who dreams of becoming a lawyer, and all 4 of her brothers and her find their educations and their lives disrupted by the war. Everything in a sort of creeping fashion, a little bit more of the frog boiling slowly in the pot at the beginning of the novel than necessarily sudden instances of violence. I'm trying also to give you background without giving you spoilers, which is tricky. So my generative class tomorrow is going to be partly about revising through plot, and it's drawn partly from things that I did revising this novel. And that meant thinking about the relationship between cause and effect. I was talking to Ian Stanton earlier today about a novel and film we both like, The English Patient, which is non-chronological, if you've read it. I admire it greatly, and I dreamed of writing a non-chronological novel. I dreamed that this would be that novel. This is not that novel. So I was trying to write it out of order, and it turned out that what that did was that it meant that I did not have to deal, or I was actually actively avoiding dealing with the consequences of anything my characters did. I really wanted them to have very pleasant lives, and I was always alluding to terrible things that would happen to them later that they didn't know about yet. And then I was like, those terrible things don't actually happen. So then another friend of mine, the wonderful, brilliant short story writer Leslie Arima, said to me very gently, Sugi, have you considered writing your novel in order? She said it so sweetly, like it was like there was no reason this should have occurred to me earlier. And it sort of really unlocked this amazing door for me where I was like, am I potentially avoiding things by avoiding time and its progression? Which it turned out I absolutely was. So through a series of events that happen chronologically in the book, we arrive at a point where Sashi is pursuing her medical education at the University of Jaffna, a real university in northern Sri Lanka that has a medical faculty. She also ends up pursuing medical education in a unofficial way by participating in a field hospital as a medic. And the field hospital is run by the Tamil Tigers. And two of her brothers have joined that movement. One is Seelan and the other is Dylan. So her second and third brothers. And she chooses to do this not out of any great sympathy for the movement, but basically because she is interested in using her skills in a more active way. She feels like she knows something, she could be helpful, and these are the only people who are giving her a way to do anything. And Kay, with whom she has a connection, he comes and says, we could use your skills in this regard. And she decides to do it. So she ends up essentially having two medical educations that intersect with each other in really uncomfortable and strange ways. So I want to read to you from a section that features the field hospital and then immediately after it, the medical school. And it features a medical student who also works at the field hospital. His name is Thambi Raja. It features Kay. And it features, of course, Sashi herself. So without further explanation, I'll tell you the other characters when we get to the medical school. Okay. A renewed but altered loneliness, born of the need for secrecy, led me to spend more and more of my time at the field hospital. I developed a knack for treating children. The other medics, mostly men, often brought me young women patients. I could not talk to my medical school friends about this space, so to this space I retreated. Here I was useful. Here I was needed and could see the difference I made. I started to bring my textbooks to the hospital and studied there at odd hours, even when I was not scheduled. I came to know almost everyone who worked there. One day, at the end of the second term, very early in the morning before school, I was at the field hospital when it was almost deserted. I was studying for an exam when a short cotter rushed in. Patient coming, he advised, and in the distance I could see Kay running towards me. Sashi, he called, and behind him I could see two other men, bearing a third. Who else is here? He cried, and I looked around to realize there were only 3 medics present. Thambi Raja, a field-trained medic, and me. As the cotters drew closer, I saw who they were carrying. My brother Seelan. I put my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My brother was conscious, or looked it, his eyes huge and shocked, his head bloody. A wound gaped above his left eye. A mine explosion, Kay said rapidly, pointing the cotters to my area, which was nearest. Thambi Raja hurried over from where he had been organizing supplies. When he saw who it was, he blanched visibly. She won't be able to treat him, Thambi Raja said to Kay. What? I said stupidly. If you help her, she can, Kay said. He turned to me. You do it, or I'll have to. I couldn't. I would. There was no time for fear. The cotters lay Seelan on a cot, and automatically I bent over him. The other medic came to my elbow and handed me a wad of wet gauze. I wiped at the blood, and Seelan muttered and groaned. Thambi Raja went behind his head and held it still with one hand. With the other, he ran his fingertips over Seelan's face and through Seelan's hair. I realized he was hunting for shrapnel. I hope it's not that deep, he said. The heads... Yes, I said. I know. The scalp bleeds. Quickly, I took another wad of gauze. The first one was already soaked. Seelan and I said, can you hear me? He focused on me almost obediently. Do you know who I am? Amma, he said, and I gasped. Sashi, Kay said from where he stood at Seelan's feet. Thangachi, Seelan muttered. This means younger sister. He lifted his hand as though to touch his wound, and Thambi Raja pushed it down. We need to keep him awake, he said. He may have a concussion. Machan, it's all right, Kay said to him. It's going to be fine. Can you stay still? In a moment, it will hurt a lot less. Kay's voice reminded me of the day he had treated me. Crack an egg, I thought, looking down at the blood on my hands. Crack one egg, and another. Put more pressure, Thambi Raja said. That's it. If he needs stitches, I can do them. The bloody gauze piled up until finally I reached the wound itself. Relief rushed through me. Seelan's eyebrow was completely gone, but beyond that, the gash was shallow. Abruptly, I sat down. The other medic seized the clean gauze from me and took over. Thambi Raja checked Seelan's eyes. Is he all right? Kay asked. I don't see any debris in his eyes. They must have been closed, Thambiraja said. And his pupils are not dilated. I don't think he's concussed. Seelan muttered. The wound is shallow, I said. Kay exhaled. Good. Behind him, I heard the Cotters murmuring to each other. He asked for my mother, I said. He thought you were your mother, Kay corrected me. He should be fine, Thambiraja said reassuringly. I wiped the back of my hand on my forehead. Are you sure? I checked Seelan's face again. He was sleeping, and the expression of pain had settled into peace. At rest, I saw, he resembled my oldest brother. We'll take care of him, Kay said. Weren't you about to go to your exam? I had entirely forgotten. The medical campus seemed a world away from what I had just done. From where he sat slumped in a chair, Thambiraja lifted his head. You did well, he said. So now she goes to the medical school. I'm sure all of you arrive at your exams completely calm. I also, as a student, did the same. She is not as fortunate. And she goes to campus where she is going to an appointment with her anatomy professor for her first year, one of her first year exams in anatomy. A woman who in this section, she uses the term for older sister with this professor, Akka, because they're also friendly. And then another student whose name is Josie. Josie is Sashi's body partner. In Sri Lankan medical school, this is often the person whose last name is next to yours on the alphabetical list. Through such coincidences, our relationships made. And they have been dissecting things together and studying together. They don't necessarily exactly like each other. And it's worth noting that Josie's strongest tie outside the medical school is to a prominent member of the militant movement, a high-up Tamil Tiger. And so she is on campus, in addition to being a medical school, known as that person's sweetheart. Although I had seen Seelan sleeping, it was his pain that stayed with me as I cycled to campus. When I tried to summon his peaceful face, only Niranjan emerged. Around and around my petals went, around and around my brain whirred. It was a quarter of an hour's journey, short enough for me to make it in time, and long enough to push me past exhaustion. My brother was all right, I told myself, but my body was caught in the long minutes, seconds of hunting for that wound, not knowing how serious it might be. My eyes went from my wristwatch to the road and back again. The time and the distance both felt wrong. I felt wrong, as though I were vibrating inside myself, moving without going anywhere. Despite going nowhere, to my confusion, I arrived. Mechanically, I dismounted. Before me, the buildings of the medical campus were enormous, disproportionate, and strange. It was the end of my second term, and my body partner Josie and I had eagerly anticipated our second rehearsal exam. That term, we had studied the head, neck, and face. When Anjali Akka entered and found us preparing, she looked at me with an expression of some concern. Are you well? She asked. I'm fine, I said. Josie, too, watched me with dismay. She was decent enough to be genuinely worried, but it was also true that if I conducted myself poorly, it would reflect on her, and vice versa. Our fates were tied together. I resolved to perform with my usual energy, as though I had not spent the morning treating my own brother at the field clinic instead of studying. We approached the table. My head rang. In the wake of ebbing adrenaline, a terrible fatigue swept over me. Josie lifted the cloth covering the body and laid it aside. You may begin, Anjali Akka said. Josie started with the left half of the face, peeling back where we had cut to reveal the architecture of bones and nerves and muscle. The face! What a miracle, Sir would have said. This is one of her previous teachers. Stop, Anjali Akka said. Describe the nasal cavity. Josie swallowed nervously and then spoke. I tried to listen but could not focus. My mouth was dry and my palms were damp. I linked my hands behind my back to prevent myself from fidgeting. Very well done, Josie, Anjali Akka said, and Josie blushed slightly, as she always did, for even the smallest bit of praise. Would Anjali Akka's words be repeated to the tiger sweetheart later? Anjali had never given any sign that she knew who Josie was. I would be just as detached and professional. Your turn, Sashi. Tell me about the facial nerve. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, of which the facial nerve is the 7th, Anjali said, prompting me. Like the vestibular cochlear nerve, the facial nerve enters the auditory canal via the temporal bone, I said. Seelan's face presented itself distractingly in my mind's eye once again, and I paused, hunting for the words that applied to this case instead of that one. Very good, Anjali said. And then? After conceding the loss of Seelan's eyebrow, I had worried about the supraorbital nerve underneath. He was fine, I reminded myself. I did not want this head, peeled apart, to turn into his. Exiting the stylomastide foramen, the nerve branches to control the expressions of the face, I said. This meant that the nerve moved through an opening in the head and spread out like the branches of a fragile tree. In my first pass at studying this, I had found it fascinating and spent a long time moving my own expression around in front of the mirror. And as the nerve branches through the face, what lies laterally along its path? Anjali asked. I stopped. The answer to this question had parts, but I could not muster the components. Someone had dropped a scalpel on the floor. That kind of carelessness was dangerous. I would have to remember to retrieve it later, I thought. If a person who experiences blunt trauma has nerve damage, it is most likely to be in this nerve, I said finally. That was not my question, Anjali Akka said. I'll repeat. As the facial nerve splits and goes through the head, what is lateral? That is, what is adjacent to the path of the nerve? I looked at her then. She was the kindest examiner we had, although she was also the most important. The sunlight of her gaze, I saw, excluded everything but me. She was measuring me in some way that had nothing to do with the exam. Josie glanced at me with rising alarm. At last, Anjali looked away from me. Josie, she asked, would you like to answer the question? Josie stepped forward and answered it at considerable length, with impressive detail. What a commendable person I had let down. I sighed, awaiting Anjali's verdict, although I knew what it had to be. As you both know, this isn't a passing mark, Anjali said. At this, prepared and responsible Josie appeared nearly ill. Generally, Anjali said, we ask you to take a fortnight and then attempt the exam again. Then if you fail, you have to repeat the body part during your holidays. But, and here she paused, I could make an exception and give you the exam again in 2 days if you think you would be ready. And in that case, I would not record this mark at all. It would be like today never occurred. It was not yet noon, and oh, how I wish today had never occurred. Such generosity was unheard of. Josie turned to me. She could reasonably have looked furious, but instead her mouth trembled. Sashi, she said. Dizziness swayed me. I could just hear Josie saying, 2 days from now should be fine, and then the dim, uncertain light of the examination room went completely out. So I will leave that particular scene there. Drawn from experiences of group work. No, I'm kidding. Kind of. I think that for Sashi, who is experiencing a lot of difficulty, her friends are often a refuge. And so having a lot of hard times studying, going to the field hospital, going back again, lying to her family about the field hospital, et cetera, et cetera. She finds that her desire to join a feminist book club has gotten shoved from a scheduling point of view to the back. And she eventually succeeds in setting it up and goes to meet with several of her friends to talk about a book called Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World, also a real book, which I recommend to you. And this scene sort of arose from my desire to think about this book and to see if I could write, I don't know, what I would describe as like a scene that hopes to be juicy about an academic text. So the book is, fortunately for me, given this challenge, anything but dry. And so I will read a little snippet from this. When the day came, I entered the room eager for our discussion and stopped in dismay. There, in the ring of chairs, was an unwelcome guest, Josie. Of course, the conversation was on university grounds and technically should have been open to anyone, but how had she, with her tiger sweetheart, come to know about it? I had taken care not to mention it widely, and the others had also been discreet, I thought. How could we have a frank discussion unless it was with people we trusted? No matter how it had happened, she was here, and we could not ask her to leave. I looked at Angelica in alarm, but her back was to me as she set out biscuits in a corner. She and I had never discussed Josie, but I was sure now she knew my body partner's affiliations. Chelvi and Tharani came up to me, smiling too brightly, and as they greeted me, Chelvi pressed my borrowed book into my hands. Taking it, I put my school bag down next to the chair with Anjali's things. When I sat and opened the book, I found a note. Question mark, question mark, question mark. All caps. What do we do? Question mark. I folded it up and tucked it away. We could censor ourselves or we could talk, as we had planned. I had no idea which was the better route. Sashi, were you going to begin? Angelica asked, taking her seat. Perhaps we should do introductions, I said pointedly. And just then, Bhavani showed up at the door, out of breath. I'll pause here for a little context. Bhavani, the members of this particular study group are Chelvi and Tharani. Tharani is another medical school student. Chelvi is an art student. Bhavani is their friend, and she is not a student. She works at a shop just outside of campus. And she's a very politically conscious person and is friends with them and is interested in doing this reading with them, so she is included. And essentially, Anjali is the faculty sponsor for this group. Bhavani, Tharani exclaimed. Excellent, I was afraid we were only having biscuits. Bhavani laid out the armful of parcels she was carrying. Then she smiled at Josie, her usual friendly smile, and I realized she didn't know who the new person was. I don't think we've met, she said cheerfully. I'm Bhavani. This is Josie, Chelvi said. She's at the medical faculty with Sashi. Sashi and I were paired for anatomy this year, Josie said. I hope you will all forgive my intruding. I heard there was a feminist group meeting and I was excited to come. I'm afraid I haven't even got the book. That's all right, Angelica said. I know Sashi has read and reread this one, so we can start with her questions. And if we move to more general conversations, that's fine. I spent every rehearsal exam in a room with Josie and Anjali. Then, as now I realized, I had prepared. If we were now about to cross a conversational minefield, well, all I could do was keep an eye out for where I wanted to arrive and what on the way there might be dangerous. I was interested in how the writer wrote about Gandhi, I said. Oh, I've always admired Gandhi, Josie said. It seems like that kind of support, satyagraha, nonviolence, is one thing women can do for the struggle. None of us asked which struggle she meant. It seemed that not having read the book was not going to prevent her from participating. That is like one of the jokes in the book. A violent book, but still, every once in a while. I grew up idolizing Gandhi, Sashi said. I grew up idolizing him, I said, because my father did. But I didn't know the nuances of some of his views. The author's critiques of Gandhi seem very persuasive. I hate the idea that women are better suited for nonviolent action because they are better at withstanding suffering. I don't want to suffer. Why should that be my role? Yes, Anjali said. And better at suffering for what? Under whose direction do women suffer? What is the right way to suffer? I really appreciated the inclusion of critiques of how conservative Tamil society oppresses women. Isn't that happening even here in Jaffna? What kind of struggle expects women to support a cause but does not address our concerns? This was rather more direct than I had expected. I wish Sri Lanka had had a leader like India's, like Nehru around its independence, Bhavani said. What if our independence had been different, rather than both that and women's rights coming so gradually? We have the vote and we can study, as the book says, but, and here she opened it to quote, the processes of education for women also contributed to the socializing of women into roles that were only superficially different from those of traditional society. Sri Lanka is thus an interesting example of a society in which women were not subjected to harsh and overt forms of oppression, and therefore did not develop a movement for women's emancipation that went beyond the existing social parameters. It is precisely this background that has enabled Sri Lanka to produce a woman prime minister, as well as many women in the professions, but without disturbing the general patterns of subordination. The general patterns of subordination. Bhavani repeated, dragging out each word. That's very accurate. I also appreciated what she said about how the gradual approach is a limitation. So many things are in the hands of bourgeois women, and where does that get anyone? She looked around. Present company excluded, she said. We don't deserve to be excluded, probably, Tharani said around a mouthful of lunch parcel. If you only work to improve things within the existing framework, then you can't question the existing framework. That seems obvious. That's why the movement is so important, Josie said. It questions the existing framework. At the mention of the movement, Tharani filled her mouth with rice and stopped talking. She had become even more cautious since her brother had joined a rival group. The movement does expect women to support the cause in all the proper ways, Chelby said. But as the author writes, isn't that within the existing patriarchal structures, Anjali said. The Tigers promised to liberate women, to lift us up, Josie said. What about the women's wing? I had heard of this. The Tigers had started a section for women in 1983, but I did not know anyone involved in it and had never treated any women fighters. I did know that, like other Tigers, the women cotters wore cyanide capsules around their necks in case of capture. This was not my idea of liberation, but I was not sure that in this room I should say so. The women's wing is very interesting, Anjali Akka said. But what is the role of dissent for feminism? Can an organization that does not allow dissent be a feminist organization? And there it was. The classroom clock ticked loudly in the echo of her question, which none of us answered, although each of us certainly had an opinion. That's a very complicated question, Shelby said. We should think about it and take a tea break. Of course, Anjali said, smiling a little bit. Yes, said Tharani, getting up. It was not that complicated of a question, but with that we scattered to serve and replenish food, talking loudly about casual matters. Josie delicately took a biscuit and excused herself quietly. When it became clear that she would not return, the rest of us stared at each other, speechless. I will stop there. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
I wonder if you could talk about the process of writing your first novel versus your second novel, and if there were any major what differences or challenges to one versus the other.
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. Well, as Sarah mentioned, I was working on my first novel when I arrived in graduate school, and it was a version of an undergraduate thesis, and it didn't have an occasion for storytelling. I think it was sort of a loose collection of family anecdotes without any reason why anyone would care about them, let alone together. And so I submitted that work to a novel class and got back some feedback on it and realized that I sort of wasn't interested in working on it anymore. And that I had a couple of years where if I didn't want to, I didn't have to. And so I put it in a drawer for a while and didn't look at it, didn't touch it, and started writing short stories, which I knew myself to be bad at. And so it was really freeing because it meant that I could go to class and sort of have written really anything I wanted to try, anything that felt interesting to me. It felt like a great space for learning in that it was low stakes. And then I think that I was actually also working on the novel at the same time through those short stories and through that freedom of sort of being like, I never have to publish these because I'm terrible at it. And then I eventually, started to I was like, oh, I like writing short stories. I love reading them. This is great and confusing. And so I think that some of the things I learned through the short stories helped me to structure the first novel. The first novel is less research-based, and so its problems really were almost purely craft-oriented, and things like how do you create a spine for a book that really doesn't want to have one, continues to flop over, how do you get it to stand up on its own? And this book By contrast, that one has something of fable to it in its tone and quality, like the quality of its voice. It's also a first-person novel. I think I figure if I write enough first-person novels, people will stop thinking that any of them are autobiographical. And so this character, like that one, presented herself with she presented herself very cleanly with like a voice that was something I could sort of just surrender to, which was nice. But this character was very interested in realism, and so was I. This book is about history that a lot of people tried very intentionally to erase. And so working at universities and through universities with all of their resources, scholars, books, gave me a lot of opportunity to cross-reference stories I had grown up with stories that were popular from one political line or another, with books by scholars. So I could sort of see like, which one did I think was true, which is usually not a question that matters for fiction. So that was really interesting I think that if you're not familiar with Sri Lankan history, the version of history that I'm portraying may not seem controversial, but it's a very particular version of Sri Lankan history that a lot of people flat out tried to delete. And so that presented a lot of, I think it took me a lot longer also. So I started it through a short story in our second year of graduate school. And I think part of it was just like, it took such a long time. So that was one of the other challenges. And I guess every book is different. So I look forward to the next challenge, which I hope is briefer. Thank you for the question. Yeah, you had a hand up back there.
Thank you for coming. I really like what you said about writing your book in sequence after with reverse chronology, and you mentioned The English Patient as a model that really made you want to write a book out of sequence. And conversely, were there any books that you turned to as kind of like your model for like the great old-fashioned novel told in sequence?
That's a great question. I was teaching a class on reading and writing the novel, and so some of my favorite novels, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, is so astonishing. And that book, I mean, it has some flashbacks in it, but it's by and large running a pretty straightforward clock. So I found that book to be helpful also because it hits so many different registers. That book is often extremely funny. It draws on comic history and has long sequences that are, drawing on an invented comic hero, but still like sort of unapologetic ambition and insistence that it could contain that much history and that you could be interested in it. I appreciated its statement of faith in the reader, and it's very much in order. Other books that are in order, there's a Sri Lankan Canadian Tamil novelist named Shyam Selvadurai. He's a groundbreaking writer, hugely influential for me, who wrote a novel in stories called Funny Boy. It's 6 stories. And it really is a novel in stories. It's not a short story collection. It's not a novel. It's a novel in stories. And it's in the first person about a little Tamil boy who grows up in the Sri Lankan capital of Colombo. And he's kind of coming to terms with his sexual orientation in the years running up to the start of the Civil War. And so that book is perfectly in order, and it ages the character in the first person. And it's kind of an incredible book, and it had so much complicated history in it. And every time I go read it, I understand more of the references he's making. So that was definitely also a model for me. And if you're wondering, if you're interested in that form at all, or actually just if you love to read, I always recommend this book. I love to teach it. I try to teach it at least every couple of years. So those are just a couple that I could mention. Yeah. Yes.
This is a question that can't really have an exact answer, but how much knowledge about this, like history in particular, would you say you had before you decided to write this, and how much did you look into after the decision?
I would say that I had fairly little knowledge of this history other than apocryphal and very occasional family stories, and afterwards a lot. So it is a mostly research novel. And I grew up in the United States. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. Any East Coast folks here? Yeah, East Coast. So I grew up in a place where there were other Sri Lankan Americans. There were some of whom were Tamil, some of whom were from other communities, and some of whom were sort of came from multiple heritages. And that was a space in which the information about this period of time came from the state. It came from propaganda, which actually includes the state in this instance. And it came sometimes from like kind of rumor. And so it was really interesting because some of the rumors, and again, I think this is all stuff that pertains more to the second book than to the first. Sometimes a rumor would be outlandish, and I would be like, is that true? Someone, like I've seen a piece of Tiger propaganda that says the state did this. Is that actually true? And then I could go and look it up in a university library and see, could I find evidence of it? And so I was doing things like cross-referencing. The Sri Lankan Civil War was fought primarily between Tamil separatists who claimed sole representation of the Tamil minority and state security forces dominated by the ethnic majority Sinhalese. There are a number of other communities that are generally erased from the Western version of this narrative. So there's a significant Muslim community. There are other Tamil communities. There are multiple Tamil communities that came in different periods of time. So there are some Tamil folks who came from India to work on tea plantations during British colonial rule. There's some Tamil communities that came earlier. Muslims in Sri Lanka are considered an ethnicity and have a distinct political community. So all of this, like none of that appeared in any of the stuff that I knew before. And so I could go look at a book and then I could, call up someone I knew and be like, I never heard as a child anything about the Muslim community in Sri Lanka. Did you interact with them when you were there? And so by cross-referencing kind of back and forth, I was able to learn a lot more. But I think largely I was hearing things that were coming from one propagandist or another, which for fiction is neither useful nor interesting. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
This feels comparatively off topic. I liked what you were saying about the idea of something isn't a short story collection or a novel, but novel and stories. I feel like recently I've read so many books that are claim that they use the title novel or they don't specify what it is, and then it ends up being a short story collection. I don't know if it's to sell better or anything. I guess, do you have strong opinions on this?
It is to sell better. People think that novels sell better. Whether there's actual market data to indicate that. I mean, there are short story collections that sell really well. They come out and they sell well, and then people are like, what an anomaly. I'm like, is it? Or do people like reading? I don't know. So yeah, I think, I do think of that book as a novel in stories that is, I can think of short story collections marketed as novels, or at least ones where there's some argument. And I think it's maybe people don't know how short story collections hang together. Remember what Sam Lipsyte was asked something about his short story collection, what ties it all together? And he's like, I wrote all the stories. That's it. That's what ties them together, which is an answer that I love. So, but I do feel like the novel in stories is a really interesting form that's sort of underused. I think linked stories or something very slightly different. Yeah, I think that people are under the misapprehension that readers at large won't read short story collections. And I just think that's not true because there's so many really good ones. So I hope all of you read short story collections. I would love to know what you're reading. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you talked a lot, near the beginning, you talked a little bit about how when you were going to read it, you were going to go over a lot of medical terminology that you weren't super familiar with. What was your experience writing a character who had knowledge of something that you might not have knowledge of? Somebody who's an expert in something you're not an expert in.
So fun. This is a kind of fakery I'm interested in. Sometimes people would ask me, what research did you do? And I'm like, I don't want to tell you that I watched a lot of Grey's Anatomy. And also I totally did, right? And they're giving you the impression of practicing medicine. My father is a physician, and you can't watch Grey's Anatomy with him because he'll just start yelling. He's like, that's not a newborn baby. That baby is 7 months old. I'm like, no one cares. No one cares how old the baby is. So I just have to give you the impression that I know enough. I have said every word in this book aloud because I read it to myself when I was proofing. So I do know how to say all those words, but like vestibular cochlear does not roll off the tongue. So yeah, I mean, I think different kinds of practice, like I remember how I researched that whole section on nerves. I think it was Wikipedia. And then cross-referencing it, you know, calling up my dad and being like, can you tell me about facial nerves? He was like, my exams were a very long time ago. And I was like, well, does this sound correct? Would you be convinced by someone who said this? And sort of testing out that language on people. Right, I was fortunate to have wonderful readers who were really rigorous and thoughtful about like what they would believe. So I was often using beta readers to kind of say, am I pulling this off? But yeah, I mean, I love reading and writing about medicine. I think it's really, really fun. So my patience for listening to someone talk about the stylomastoid, whatever, like is pretty endless. So that helped. Sarah?
This might be a writer nerd question, but we're writer nerds, so I'll just go there. I was thinking a lot about management of time as I was reading, and I think like there's a kind of slowness to the opening that I think matches the character's arc of awareness, because she has no idea what the larger picture, well, none of us do, but norms are disrupted in a dramatic way. And I wondered if going into this novel you had a sense of how you wanted to manage slow time, fast time, how much time you wanted to cover, and whether your arc of awareness in the writing process shifted or changed.
Thanks for that question. I don't know if any of you have read Elizabeth Bowen's essay on writing a novel, but she talks about time, and it's really helpful. It just sort of talks about a clock ticking in the background all the time. I think I read that pretty late in working on the book, but I did find it helpful. I guess I was writing in a tradition of literature that a lot of Sri Lankan literature is about the war. A fair amount of it covers the years leading up to the war, and then use the Black July riots, which are anti-Tamil pogroms that took place in the capital city that were perpetrated by state-aligned mobs with data that was taken from voter rolls and things like that. They use that as kind of a climax. Funny Boy actually also does this. And when you talk to people about the years after that, there's a muddiness to how they sometimes talk about it, like especially in diaspora where sometimes just the information was unreliable. So people sort of would stop talking about it as though it was an impossible story to tell. And I didn't like that because I had lived through those years and had done that on the East Coast of the United States. But it was also like, I would like to know, surely someone can explain this. And so I think that's part of why the information was not very easy to access. It became really murky, and some of the events, honestly, like so unpleasant, people did not want to talk about them. And I think through like a set of circumstances that were essentially telling me not to do it, this is for me a very good writing prompt to be told not to do something. And so I think that was part of, like, I just didn't like that all of these other books stopped at 1983. It's like Sri Lankan history goes past that, and a lot of other books also contain 2009, which is the end of the war. And in between, there was all this other stuff, which was really interesting to me. Years in which, like, young men were going directly from, essentially college prep courses to militancy. What does that look like? And so that contributed, I think, a lot to my question of them. I didn't realize how interested I was in that, or that I would have to acquire a lot of skills I didn't have to do that. Because when I started writing this, it was for a class on the novella that Ethan Kanan was teaching. Were you in that class? Yeah. And I hadn't registered for that class. I wasn't in that class. And then my cool friends had signed up for the class. Everyone had signed up for the class but me. And I was like, how do I get into the class? So I talked my way into it by volunteering to go first. And I did not write a novella, but I did turn in a very long short story, which is essentially part of this novel. And it was sort of through that I was like, oh my God, I'm really interested in this. And I think I 100% am not equipped to do it at all. So I think the management of time, it took me a while to realize what I was interested in, and then to tell it in order, and then to realize that the slowness was actually part of it, that a lot of it is them sitting around waiting for violence to happen and to try to make that interesting, which is a test. Thank you all so much for coming out on this beautiful evening so early in your semester and asking such wonderful questions. I'm happy to take any other questions if people have them, but I also would love to let you go and enjoy your evening.
Also, let me remind everyone that there are books to purchase, and you're welcome. You're happy to sign them?
I am happy.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to sign them.
Yeah, so you're welcome to ask for them to be signed. Let's give Sugi a round of applause.